Okay, everybody, welcome. Continuing with our test and measurements lecture, we are going to be talking about chapter 7 today, okay, about fairness and bias. Very interesting issue. So let me pull up my screen here and we'll get right to it. So on this issue of fairness and bias, we're going to be talking about means of how we study fairness, how that's assessed through psychometric research methods. We'll talk about accommodations and modifications in administering tests. And we'll also have a discussion about intelligence, theories of intelligence, what do we know, and how to think about group differences on IQ research. And then finally, the relationship about heredity and the environment. Yeah, the latter part of our discussion today certainly being relevant to the paper topic and considering government public policy and reproduction. Alrighty, so moving right along. So fairness refers to a characteristic of a test and the test's ability to measure a construct equally in different groups. Okay. So if you have an IQ test, you want IQ to be measured, the construct to accurately be measured, but in the same way in both groups. Yeah, you don't want IQ test that measures more verbal IQ in one group, and then the very same test measuring more spatial abilities, or heck, even music abilities in another group, right? You're looking for a test that measures a certain construct, or maybe even a group of constructs, but the same construct or group of constructs equivalently, the same, equally across different groups, across gender, ethnic race, whatever. Okay. A test is biased, as we spoke about in the previous chapter, if it does not measure the construct of interest in the same way across different groups. Okay, if it's looking at the same construct but measuring it differently in different groups, or if it's actually, even though the test purports to be an IQ test, it's actually not measuring IQ, but maybe different constructs in different groups. Right? So that is test bias, as we had discussed before. So one of the ways this might manifest itself, yeah, in the first situation, we don't have a problem. Yeah, we don't have bias in that, group A may differ than group B on some ability. Yeah, physical, intellectual, emotional, whatever. I mean, groups do differ. Yeah, ethnic, racial, cultural, national, gender, whatever. Yeah, age groups differ. But if you're measuring what you purport to measure, yeah, IQ, temperature, whatever the case may be, the same construct. If the groups differ, they're going to perform differently on the test. Okay, that's what we want. No bias, right? The test is measuring the construct equivalently. But in a bias test, right, be it temperature, whatever, psychological construct, right, if the groups are equal, actually, factually, in truth, right, equal, but the test shows group C is performing differently than group D, that's a problem. Yeah, you probably got a biased test on your hands. Yeah, odds are you have a biased test on your hands. Ready? So how do we determine this kind of thing? Well, we'll talk about three basic methods. The first is by way of panel review. Yeah, so as the term connotes, this would be a situation where you would have a panel of experts. Yeah, several experts, psychologists, for example, psychometricians. It depends on what you're measuring. Yeah, and that panel would review the test items, the test in its entirety, but also each of the individual items. Yeah, do the individual items seem to tap into the construct of interest? This certainly relates to things such as content, criterion validity, construct validity, and so on. More validity than reliability, although reliability, as we discussed before, is related. Yeah, if you're really measuring something, then you should you should be obtaining reliable measurements as well. Okay, so you have, let's just say it's a question of, I use this example quite frequently in this discussion because it certainly has been probably the most controversial, the measurement of intelligence across different groups or abilities. Yeah, like athletic, occupational abilities, and so on. Okay. So what the examiners would do would be to see if the test, right, if there's any kind of bias across gender, like for example, across gender, ethnic, racial group, and so on. Is the wording, for example, an IQ test in favor of one group over another because of, let's just say, their cultural experiences, but not because of intellectual development? You know, you want your test to be measuring in an IQ test, right? Mental ability, that mental muscle, and one's capacity to perform, not one's cultural experience, not because they've been exposed more to the ballet or opera as opposed to, let's say, religion or whatever the case may be, or a particular religion. Yeah, you want the test to be tapping into your, in this case, mental ability. Yeah, not a particular cultural or let's say a regional experience. All righty. So they examine it, and if they see how it may be biased in favor of one group or another, or lead to the measurement of a construct differently or different constructs, then there would be a revision of the items, yeah, or it be changed to be more neutral. Okay. Now there are certain limitations with this approach. Yeah. Um, First of all, who's going to be on the panel? And that could be huge, especially for something like IQ. Yeah, or the SATs or GREs, not IQ tests per se, but they have the objective of measuring the same thing, mental ability. And a lot of times with these panels, you might have discussions go in the direction and resulting in change, but it really arises from the panelists' own opinions about what items of wording or grammar or writing style leads to a um, potential bias. Yeah. So a lot of it may arise from opinions. It's not all research driven. Ideally, it'll be largely research driven, but a lot of it really comes down to the panelists sharing their opinions on what they think, you know, someone from a certain group, how they would read or interpret or experience an item. The other is the differential item function. Yeah, we're talking about methods of determining fairness. This is the second of the three. Differential item functioning. Now, this is a method that approaches item analysis statistically. Okay, to examine specifically if individual items function differently for different groups. Okay, um, for different groups of, it should be different groups of examinees. Yeah, not examiners, examinees, for different groups of examinees. Am I writing? So a very common comparison will be comparing majority group members to a focal group member or minority group member. Yeah, so examining white performance versus black performance, white, Asian, and so on. Yeah, or in a different locality, right? In an Asian country, obviously the reference group would be Asian, and maybe the focal group would be white or Latino, what have you. Okay. And what you really want to be looking for is an issue of whether an external criterion suggests that the groups, if an external criterion determines if the group should be the same, but the differential item functioning showing that they're operating differently. Okay, one approach or procedure is the Mantel-Haenszel approach. Okay, what does this approach involve? Okay, well, these are the basic steps of the Mantel-Haenszel procedure. Okay, so what you do is you divide, right, the sample of examinees into reference and focal groups. Okay, um, based on test scores and, you know, things that you think are suspect items. Okay. And then you divide the test into certain intervals, could be 10-point intervals, whatever, seems to, which will allow you to possibly see patterns in the responses, right? So you look at, let's say in a 100-item exam, you look at maybe a 10-point intervals, 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, and so on until you get to 100. Looking at those intervals of chunks, and then to see if the two groups perform differently within each of those intervals. Yeah. So what you might do is count the number of people who get correct and wrong in the white group, the reference group, versus the African American group. Yeah, right and wrong, and so on. And then after, if you see certain patterns, right, certain things kind of popping out, right? Now, what's not an issue is when the reference and focal groups perform similarly. But if within an interval, as we mentioned, a 10-point interval, for example, you see a difference between the white and black performance, yeah? You might want to look to see what individual items and how the two groups, reference and focal, may be performing differently. Yeah, so in this illustration, right from your textbook, this example has item 19, 27, and 36 listed. Yeah, and on the y-axis, you have the probability of getting the response correct. And on the x-axis, yeah, we have theta listed here. Yeah, and theta, as we mentioned before, is a value which allows the researcher to examine the item along some kind of examinee response pattern. Yeah, very typically a response pattern, like for example, an IQ or an achievement test is in terms of measuring a response pattern indicating, greater performance or greater performance on an item. Okay, so it's measuring, the proportion of people who get it wrong and who don't get the item versus those who do get the item, yeah, or approach and so on. Yeah, so that's what theta allows you for. It provides a mathematical value to examine a particular response or pattern of performing on an item. So here we can look at theta across 19, 27, and 36. Yeah, and here the reference group is a solid line. The focal is a broken line there. And we can see, right, with item 19, they seem to perform the same. But with item 27, yeah, when you are looking across theta, the reference group demonstrates this performance. The focal group does better initially, but if this is like, let's say, a continuum of difficulty, yeah, for a given item, yeah, that the reference, the focal group, right, as they experience it more, as they experience the difficulty of the item, tend to do poorly, right? Whereas with 36, right, they do better, but then they do about the same as the reference group. So that's kind of the idea, all righty? Now, with differential prediction, this is the third of the three factors that we have spoken about. Alrighty, this refers to what we had discussed in the previous chapter about the use of the multiple regression line, and determining whether there is statistical test bias. Okay, as we discussed before, there are two types of test bias: intercept and slope bias. As you recall, this is evidence of test bias. Okay, and here we're talking about how the test itself, by the way it's constructed, is incorrectly measuring something different in each of the two groups. Alrighty, you can have more groups, but just for simplicity, we'll look at two groups. Alrighty, so if you gave the same test to two groups, yeah, ethnic, racial, gender, age, whatever. Well, age, that'll differ, right? It'll depend on what you're measuring. But here, let's just say it's something we expect groups to generally be the same, but there may be differences, and we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so let's just say based on some external criterion, you don't expect the groups to be different. All right, so here's group A, group B. Again, it could be any particular variable, ethnic, race, gender, and so on. Yeah, but group A produces this regression line, and group B produces this regression line. Now, the problem here, they each have the same slope. Yeah, rise over run is about the same. Yeah, same slope, but they produce two different y-intercepts. If that's the case, what you have are two regression lines. Yeah, in other words, two constructs. And in other words, something measured in group A, which is not the same as in group B. And that's not what you want, right? You want your test to be measuring one thing, whatever that may be. The other kind of test bias you can have is what's referred to as slope bias. So let's say the same test is given to two groups. You have reason to think that they're the same based on some external criterion like GPA or another test. But when you collect the data, group A produces this line and group B produces this line. Okay? So here, the issue we're not focusing in on, although they do have two different y-intercepts, but particularly of concern here is that we have two different slopes. Yeah, rise, you can much steeper slope here than here. Rise over run. Yeah, much steeper slope here, which again which is further support that your test is demonstrating test bias. There's something in the instrument itself. Yeah, we're not talking about the examiner being biased or how the person's scores afterwards are interpreted by another person, right? Which could be biased, or even who's being recommended for testing, there could be bias. All righty. Here we're talking about the test itself being problematic, being constructed poorly. And here's a situation where there's no bias. Yeah, you administer the one test to two groups and they produce this data. Okay, one line, one slope, one y-intercept. Okay. Now, it very well may, now here's a different circumstance. Now, in the prior circumstance, let's say there was an external criterion that said that they should be the same, but they're not here. In this situation, right, it's different in that group A may actually perform better than group B for whatever combination of reasons. Alrighty, I mean, groups just factually differ sometimes. And not all the time, but sometimes they do. Why they do is a completely different issue. Yeah, maybe completely separate, apart from the test itself. But at least here, you can't say that you have test bias, right? Because it's one regression line, one slope, one y-intercept. So here, your test is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It seems to be measuring one construct in two groups. The groups may differ, but that's not a problem with the test. It's just the groups may differ. So you don't have test bias. Yeah, very good. We spoke about mental ability and how there is not evidence of test bias, so we won't revisit that. Accommodations and modifications, as you all are well familiar, even if you have a good, well-constructed test, accommodations may be necessary in order to properly measure a construct in an individual, yeah, because of a disability they have, either physical or psychological. And often, physical and psychological, the distinction between the two is kind of not an factual distinction, right? Because anything biological usually has a psychological component and vice versa. Alrighty, but because of a disability, right, administering the test to someone who suffers from that disability will not allow you to measure the construct accurately. Yeah. So for example, if you had an IQ test, okay, and one part of the test involves the person looking at pictures and arranging the pictures in a certain order. You saw an example of that. I think it was chapter 6. We did that. Now, someone who's visually impaired and certainly legally blind, it would probably not be fair at all to give them that same picture arrangement test, right? Because they can't see the pictures. And if they get a low score, it's clearly a function of their being blind and not because they can't logically figure a sequence of events. Okay, so you might come up with an accommodation by which the person can figure out the problem. So maybe an accommodation would be, for example, someone reading in Braille what's going on in each picture. Yeah, so they're reading in Braille what's going on in each picture, and then they go, okay, that's going on in that picture, that's going on in this picture, then we put it in a logical order. Okay, or if they're just visually impaired but not legally blind, but they could be legally, with blindness it varies. Sometimes they're completely blind and you don't see anything, right? Just blackness. Or it could be just your vision is really impaired, but if you get large print reading material with your glasses and what have you, very strong prescription glasses, you're able to read it. But by changing the print of the test, that's an accommodation. Yeah, that's a change in the test. But you need to do that change in order to allow the person to, read something so that they can answer the question. So allowing you to measure the construct. Okay. Well, it becomes kind of tricky and you know, subject to examination and should be subject to research as well, is whether an accommodation actually changes what you're measuring. Yeah. So for example, if instead of just large print for visually impaired person, what if the visually impaired person was provided a reader? Yeah, someone who actually read to them the stories on each card. Would that actually change what you're measuring? It may be, right? Because now it's auditory stimuli, and you know, and there's something about having a person there reading it to you. You know, does first of all, does that help? You know, you would think it. I mean, certainly getting the information helps, but having someone read it as opposed to you reading it, does that also throw in certain dynamics into what you're measuring, keeping you from measuring the construct of interest, which in this case would be IQ? Okay. Ultimately, in the end, what you want is a way you can give the test to someone, provide an accommodation, which allows you to measure the construct of interest so that you can use the same norms. All righty. Now, what is the research on accommodations? Do they help? Yeah. The tricky thing with this area is that the practices and regulations in terms of what kind of accommodations can be allowed, right, legally and are allowed, frequently change. Yeah. So whatever research has been conducted is limited, right? Because then there are changes, and now you got to do research on the more recent changes. Okay. But at least from what we can gather, it seems as though the objectives of accommodations are being met. In other words, by having these accommodations to how we normally administer a test to an individual, allows us to get a better measure of the construct of interest. Yeah. Um, and, and, you know, it's not just making it easier and they're not performing way better, or even, or if you can imagine, way worse than what you would anticipate. Yeah, if you can validly measure the construct of interest. Now, one issue which you know we won't get into a discussion. We won't get into a discussion. Right? Well, we can't get into a discussion because it's a YouTube video. But something to think about is whether scores based on accommodation should be flagged. Yeah, as a general matter, they're not, right? Unless that person, when they go to a different institution, discloses that they have a disability. But otherwise, as a general rule, they are not. Okay, but that's an interesting issue, right? Because if you've administered the test differently, you know, should those interpreting the score understand how that it was administered differently? Now, I want to get into the little discussion about a modification. Okay? Modification is different from accommodation. Accommodation, as we had described before, you know, is utilizing a variation of the test so you can measure the same construct. Okay. A modification is an attempt to measure a skill or trait, but using a different methodology. All righty. So, you know, instead of just, you know, increasing the size of the print, yeah, or taking the same story but converting it from regular print to Braille, something of that sort, yeah, we're talking about trying to measure the construct of interest here, for example, intelligence, by using a very different methodology, using a different test, okay? Essentially a modification, but it would essentially be a different test, yeah. So that's a distinction I just want to draw out. Okay, it's so instead of your methodology, say, be just reading off words, maybe you would use like when testing for vocabulary, right? You're given a list of words and you read off that list, right? Maybe an accommodation would be, you know, for someone who's deaf, right? Just well, with someone the way the IQ test for tests vocabulary, the examinee has a copy of the list in front of them, and then the examiner reads off the words. So for someone who's visually impaired, right, they obviously can't see the same list, but maybe they can get a Braille copy version. That's an accommodation. Alrighty, a minor change taking into account the disability. A modification might be coming up with a very different way of assessing vocabulary, and maybe it's a reading comprehension test, or or something of that sort. Yeah, so using a different methodology, which is very different from saying just reading off words and telling the examinee to define those words. Okay, so that's what I wanted to discuss regarding fairness and accommodations and modifications. Let's talk about intelligence. Yeah, um, really a complex, incredibly hotly debated topic. Yeah, it's been researched for decades now, but it's had a very thorny history. Yeah, um, because the implications of the result are incredibly controversial and have really strong implications. Yeah, that is why it's part and parcel of our, second debate topic. Yeah, because it's really an important issue, which manifests itself in different ways. Yeah, in education, what's done is, we measure performance of achievement, but we also do measures of ability, right? Like with the SAT, the GRE, you can go back to the PSAT, right? And then you have different subject GREs and so on. Alrighty. And those are tests of ability. And that's what we think of with intelligence. Yeah. We're looking at one's mental ability, their capacity, their potential. Right. And that has really large implications in terms of education, occupation, income, and so on. Yeah. And which have had really very hotly debated research in terms of gender, ethnic, racial groups, and so on. Yeah, the findings of differences and what those differences mean. So let's try to parse through some of those issues. First, let's start with a bit of history. Yeah, in terms of the classical theories of intelligence. Yeah, on or about the 30s and 40s, among the initial theories were Spearman's G theory. Now, what Spearman proposed is that intelligence can be described as kind of a singular construct, what he would refer to as G, yeah, kind of a general overall intelligence. Yeah. Now, how was this measured? Well, this was measured by using different tests of cognitive ability, like attention, vocabulary, and so on. Okay. And what Spearman found was that there was a lot of intercorrelation, overlap among the different types of subtests. And so for Spearman, that was evidence that if vocabulary, solving puzzles, logical reasoning, mathematical ability, all shared a lot, they tended to correlate really highly. For him, that was evidence that they have the shared general intelligence in common. Okay, and where they didn't share, because they weren't perfectly correlated, they weren't correlations like perfect correlation is 1.0, right? They never had anything of that sort. They always deviated. Yeah, they may have deviated like you may have had intercorrelations like 0.40 to 0.60. Yeah, and in some rare cases maybe 0.80. So what the 0.40 and 0.60 didn't account for, right? The other 0.60 or 0.40, Spearman just attributed to error. All right, things that we're really not too sure what the tests aren't tapping into, but kind of relegating them to a something to be investigated later, but that the intercorrelations, which are of primary interest for Spearman, seem to suggest that there was this overall intelligence, yeah, that seemed to be related to all these functions. Now, for Thurston, he took a different view of the same data, yeah, and similar data that he collected. But for him, the degree of lack of correlation was far more extensive than in his view, Spearman was given credit for. All righty, and that lack of that actually what he found, yeah, were that those same kinds of abilities, vocabulary, logic, arithmetic, and so on, yeah, were evidence that there are actually several mental abilities that go to intelligence. Yeah, and he came up with a list of 9 primary mental abilities, and here they are: verbal, mathematical ability, memory, reasoning. Yeah, and when you look at these lists, right, it kind of mirrors the larger factors that go to the SAT, right? Verbal ability, mathematical ability, yeah. And now there's a writing component. So you can see how a lot of these classic mental abilities in the mid 20th century, yeah, are still with us with tests of mental ability like the SAT and the GRE. And one of the things that I do want to clarify is that the SAT and GRE are not IQ tests. Alrighty, an IQ test is a different type of test where we'll be looking at that very soon in the next chapter, chapter 8. Okay. That said, they do fall into the same category of overall mental ability tests. Okay. We'll draw out how an IQ test is really vastly different from, say, an SAT or GRE, but they do share some characteristics in common. Now, another theory that arose around the 60s and 70s was Cattell's theory of hierarchical model of intelligence. Okay, so for Ray Cattell, and this is a picture of Ray Cattell, he saw intelligence as basically functioning along two major factors. Okay, he's kind of seen as the father of factor analysis, right? And factor analysis, as you may recall from statistics or research methods, is a statistical procedure by which one takes a whole bunch of items, it could be hundreds of items, and examines how they're intercorrelated and whether all the intercorrelations among the potentially hundreds of items, how they group together into larger common segments. Yeah. So all these intercorrelations between these hundreds of tests or items, how do they group together into kind of like mega super correlations? How are they related? Okay. And for Cattell, factor analysis showed that with a lot of the items here, from like Thurston and other similarly positioned researchers, that there seemed to be two different types of intelligence, crystallized and fluid. Okay. Now, crystallized, first of all, I recognize that there was, let me take a step back. With crystallized intelligence, that would account for abilities that are a function of learning. So things with facts, figures, languages, things of that sort. Alrighty, that are a function of an environment and learning that we can accumulate over time. Alrighty. The other factor he referred to as fluid intelligence. Now, fluid intelligence, he saw as being more rooted in biology, something that arises from genetics. And they include abilities like memory, reaction time, and so on. So there are these abilities which we acquire from experience over time, and then there are those abilities which we're kind of born with, which affect how we take in the crystallized intelligence information. And the two actually probably, and Cattell recognized this too, interacted. All right, in the sense that your crystallized intelligence affected how much you could acquire from the environment, and what you acquired from the environment also would affect how the functioning of your fluid intelligence. So that's Cattell's hierarchical model. That there's this overall G, but it's really broken down. To really understand intelligence, you got to understand how it's broken down into two factors, and then what the next step is to understand, and it's been done, a lot of research to understand what cognitive functions go to each of those factors. Okay. One thing I just want to touch on is very quickly is Cattell, later in his life, related to his research on intelligence and views on intelligence, developed this, I guess you can describe it as an intellectual philosophical position about the nature of science and public policy. And he was a proponent of the idea that public policy should be driven by science, that we collect the data, factor analyze the data to see different factors and how they contribute to different outcomes. And that by using these, by collecting data, running statistical analyses, including factor analysis, I don't think he would say just factor analysis, and then deriving, seeing how the data plays out, that should guide public policy. It shouldn't just be guided by, moral reasoning, which might be affected by history, by religion, by culture, right? But rather, he would say, go by the science, go by the data, and that should dictate policy. All right, when we meet later, probably want to talk a little bit about this to see what are your thoughts regarding beyondism, whether if we just use data to drive public policy, and specifically, I'm sorry, also just add, he would argue other things. So his philosophy of beyondism, proposed that one of the things that really fostered intellectual, growth and market productivity was competition. And he thought that the supreme value was group survival. Alrighty, so he thought nations should compete, and part of this competition is fostered by limiting immigration and maintaining national borders, and by that, by fostering that, groups are more likely to compete, right, and so on. And he also took the position that we should encourage intelligent people to have more children, but discourage less intelligent people from reproducing. Again, using data in order to affect public policy. All righty. Well, with that, we will have a discussion about this a little later, and I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts about this very provocative and controversial philosophical intellectual position. Okay, we'll skip some of this. We'll talk about this too. Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, and what does Malcolm Gladwell propose in terms of performance? And he's talking about people who are seen as super performers, either intellectually, in athletics. What contributes to that? And that's certainly relevant as we're talking about intelligence and measuring it and seeing how people perform. But again, we'll have this discussion when we meet. Let me get out of here for a moment. Okay, hi everyone. Just took a quick little break there, and let's get right back to what we're doing. So, last spoke about Malcolm Gladwell, but we'll just move on here. Measuring intelligence. Now, how this is done, we'll get into the specifics more so in Chapter 8, but let's talk about issues of measuring IQ in different populations. Alrighty. Now, when measuring subjects across a lifespan, how we do so has to vary. You can't give the same kind of IQ test to an adult to an infant as you would an adult or to a child. For an infant, you can measure IQ, but you use tests that tend to focus more on things related to sensory motor development. So you look at when or how an infant would turn over, how they lift their heads in response to hearing a sound, for example, how they follow a moving object with their eyes, how they scan that object, take notice, scan an object, and so on. It would also involve a structured interview with the parents to examine, to measure, to assess, when the infant met certain milestones. So because of the infant's inability to speak at that point, infancy is typically considered the first year of life. Right? You're not going to be measuring verbal behavior, but you're going to be measuring sensory motor behavior. And we'll talk about how you can actually make an assessment or prediction about later intellectual functioning, even from these early behaviors. With children, though, you can already administer tests related to verbal abilities as well as visual spatial performance. Okay. Now, there will be a number of items which will differ as a function of age, but for the most part, they still get at these different larger factors, verbal and visual spatial ability. But a large part of what goes into childhood IQ assessment also involves observation of the child in different circumstances. Yeah, when possible, a school observation, home observation, and so on. Yeah, although very often a child's IQ can just be based on in examination room settings, yeah, in 2 or 3 sessions. And finally, for adults, intelligence is measured by providing tests that tap into the same parameters, verbal as well as visual spatial abilities. Now, predicting IQ from infancy, for the longest time, it was thought, for decades, it was thought in decades in the early and mid part of the 20th century, was thought that you could never really measure IQ in infancy, that it just um, was too early to do so, nor would we be able to do so. But in the latter part of the 20th and now in the early part of the 21st, it's pretty clear that there are a lot of different abilities that you can measure, yeah, and that can be correlated with later IQ. Okay, so for example, in a study done by Rose and Feldman, what they had measured was they measured in the subjects included 6 to 8 month old infants, okay, who are later retested at age 2, 3, into childhood now, 6, 11, and up into age 12. And what they found and what they did, well, what they initially measured were very simple sensory motor abilities, such as visual recognition. And what they did was they used a design that they is referred to as cross-modal transfer. Alrighty. So, for example, a very common design would be having the infant, right, look at some kind of visual stimulus like a mobile, right, with certain shapes like a triangle, square, or circle. Okay. And then while where they're sitting, right, they would be touching objects which would be the same or different in shape as what they saw in the mobile. So if they were shown triangle shapes on the mobile, right, they'd be holding triangle shapes in their hands. Now, if there was a discrepancy between what they saw and what they felt, right, they would notice this. Right? As a general matter, an infant will notice it at varying degrees, at different times in their development, right? But the older they get, the quicker that the quicker they're likely to notice the difference, and so on, and spend time with the stimulus. Okay, so for example, if they're seeing a triangle, right, but then they start feeling a square. Okay. Now, the other thing I just needed to add, one common design was putting a cloth over their hands so that they couldn't see the shape. They could only see the shape on the mobile, right? So if these were shown a triangle, they'd be looking at a triangle, but then their hands would be beneath the cloth, but they would get a shape to hold on to. Right? And if it was the same shape, right, they would say, oh, the infant would be feeling a triangle and looking at a triangle. But if they were given a different shape, right, they were shown a circle, but then given a square, what was measured was how quickly the child would notice the difference and how long they would attend to that difference. Okay, that's what cross-modal transfer refers to. What they found was a moderate correlation between 0.40 and 0.50 between a child's ability to notice that kind of difference, attend to that difference, and later IQ performance in early and later childhood, and at the beginning of adolescence. It's really striking finding. And there have been numerous other studies demonstrating similar findings. Yeah, that in other words, even as early as infancy, there's a correlation between infancy IQ functioning and later childhood functioning. Now, for other special populations, we have tests designed, as we mentioned before, if there's visual impairment, hearing impairment, okay? And they tend to be modified versions of standardized tests, okay, that are typically administered to those who are not disabled. Okay, so slight variations, accommodations, allowing one to administer the WAIS or Stanford to a person with a disability. Now, when administering an IQ score, to other types of populations suffering from psychological disorders, it's important for the examiner to be aware of different cognitive issues with different populations. Okay, for example, as you can imagine, with a population suffering from dementia, if you have an examinee, a patient who's taking an IQ test, among the things you got to really look out for is how are problems regarding memory, as well as abstract reasoning, logical thought reasoning. okay, problem solving, and so on. With those suffering from schizophrenia, it's very common for those suffering from schizophrenia to demonstrate a lower IQ than the average. Alrighty. Abstraction abilities tend to be impaired. There's also problems with visual organization. Okay. But what's really important to know is to understand premorbid functioning. Yeah. Now, premorbid refers to pre the onset of the first episode, okay, or the initial symptoms. Okay. So, in other words, you need to find out what their IQ functioning was before they were diagnosed or before they were starting to suffer from schizophrenia. Okay. Now, if you're lucky enough, you might have an IQ score that was actually administered prior to the onset of the disorder. But if not, you use indirect measures of intelligence, such as maybe school performance, occupational performance, and so on. Yeah, so it's really important to understand the nature of the individual's IQ functioning, right? Because they may have a low IQ score while they're suffering from schizophrenia, right? They're well medicated, they're able to take a test while medicated or while under treatment, and they demonstrate a low IQ. But it's really important to get premorbid function to understand how to interpret that IQ. Yeah, because if it turns out that their premorbid functioning was high, they were on the dean's list, right? They had a job and they really performed well. That really tells you a lot more about the impact of the schizophrenia on the patient's intellectual functioning. However, if their premorbid functioning was low, they got lousy grades, they never held a job or could hold a job. And then that tells you, all right, the schizophrenia may still be affecting their cognitive functioning, but maybe not as bad as previously thought. Okay. Here's an example of the of one subtest. It's called picture completion. And we'll talk about in class how someone with schizophrenia may respond to this card. Okay. Same here. Another one from picture completion. We'll talk about, again, a type of a response that someone suffering from schizophrenia may give. Yeah. As opposed to someone suffering from another condition or not having any mental disorder at all. All righty, here we get to a very controversial, very hotly disputed area that I mentioned to you at the beginning of today's lecture, which is the finding of group differences. Yeah, group differences being across, different variables like gender, ethnic race, and so on. Okay, to start us off in this discussion, around 1999, a book came out, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life by Herrnstein and Murray. And what Herrnstein and Murray proposed was that at that point, we had a few decades of research examining IQ differences across racial groups. Yeah, traditionally designated racial groups, right? Black, Latino, Asian, with differences found. Yeah. And very typically those differences show blacks performing about one standard deviation below whites, Latinos similarly, and Asians about the same as whites, but doing better on visual spatial. Yeah. And these authors, and they were not alone, proposed that, if we've had decades of research supporting fairly consistently showing group differences and these differences across these groups, that maybe this suggests to us that we should stop trying to eradicate differences, but rather use resources in order to support, fund different groups of people based on what their particular strengths are. Okay, find ways for people with different intellectual levels to live together. All right. Oof. You already can see just how provocative that proposal is. Yeah, and it's really kind of and really important implications. Yeah, and concerning implications. Now, what does this kind of point us to do? Well, it leads us to take really serious consideration into thinking about how we need to interpret results from these kinds of studies. Okay. Now, as I noted before, you know, there has been decades of research finding differences between groups, not consistently, but some general findings across different groups, as I just described a moment ago. Yeah. But what's really important is to understand how to understand the data. Right? You don't just take the numbers and just presume, run with those numbers and presume that, well, if there are differences between groups, it must be because of something innate, inherent, genetic about group membership. Okay. Now, here's a couple of things. I don't want to sound like I'm talking from two sides of my mouth. Okay. Now, the reality is that if there are differences, if the results seem to suggest that, yeah, it's probably an interaction of genetics and environment. Okay. What's the nature of that interaction? Well, that's what science needs to elucidate. Okay. That said, right? You also have to be able to think critically about these findings. Okay. One of the things that's among the things that's really important to keep in mind is that when IQ research um, results suggest or support a finding of differences between men and women or between blacks, whites, Asians, Latinos, you got to keep in mind that these differences are group differences. Okay. In other words, you got to picture the data as being bell-shaped curves overlapping each other. Yeah. Each curve has its own mean, and the study is saying the two means differ in a statistically significant manner. Yeah. But even though the group means may differ, yeah, if you look at both bell-shaped curves, right, there's substantial overlap between those curves. You may have discussed issues of this, like issues similar to this in intro as well as research methods. Yeah. So in other words, if one group performs higher than another, yeah, there are also a number of people, if group A performs better than group B, right, because the bell-shaped curves overlap with each other, there are a lot of people in group B who perform better than those in group A, and a lot of people in group A who perform much more poorly than those in group B. Okay, so although there are group differences, they're bell-shaped curves with substantial overlap. The other thing to keep in mind is that these group differences, they're not experiments, alrighty? They're quasi nature. These are groups that already exist, and you're examining differences between them. Okay? It's analogous. They're not correlational design, right? But essentially, what you're looking at are, it's essentially data in which you can't, establish that the causative factor is group membership. It's not an experiment. It's quasi nature. Yeah, and it's in terms of how you interpret the data, it's correlation. It's you interpret it similarly as you would a correlation. Okay? Just because scores relate, right? Being in group A, group B is related to the means, right? You can't say that group membership causes the score differences. Group membership may be related to the mean difference, but it doesn't mean group membership causes the difference. Okay. In other words, it's not. You can't say it's necessarily something inherent, innate, genetic about the group that causes the mean difference. We don't know what the differences are due to. Okay. A large part of it may be a function of group membership as it interacts with the environment. Yeah. And certainly, when you look at black and white differences, yeah, in terms of IQ differences and so on, yeah, as I mentioned, there are a number of studies that show that African Americans score about one standard deviation below whites on verbal and visual spatial. All righty. But certainly, one can see the potential historical as well as current environmental circumstances that may contribute to that. Yeah. Um, so I think that's the big pause you got to put on with group differences, findings of group differences in IQ research. Yeah, so the nature of the studies are essentially correlational in nature. Yeah, and that you cannot say, because they're not experiments, you can't assign someone to be white or black, right? They just are white or black, right? So the group differences, they don't, you can't, just like with the correlational study, right? Just because you find a relationship between two variables, similar with the quasi design, just because you find group membership is related to mean differences on a score, you can't say that group membership causes the score difference. Okay. The other thing that the research also shows, if you look at the data, yeah, is that over time, the differences between blacks and whites and Latinos and Asians, and also between men and women, yeah, are becoming less and less over. And it's almost like with each decade, right? I mean, you find fewer studies that find significant differences between the groups or between the genders, ethnic racial groups, or between the genders. Yeah, and that probably arises as a function of greater attempts in the last few decades to increase opportunities across different groups and so on. Yeah, take out bias from tests and so on. Right. Very complex issue, but in a nutshell, these are some of the things to think about when hearing about group differences on IQ. Yeah, how to think about the data, the research designs, and how to think about the results. All righty. I think I'll just kind of bypass this. We might touch upon this when we meet personally. There are generally differences across age, yeah, that have been found. In terms of general intelligence, there is usually a very steep growth from infancy to about 12 years of age. And then that growth tends to, become more moderate, high, a very steep kind of slope, but then becomes more moderate between 12 and 20. And it kind of averages, stays about stable between from 20 to 60. Okay, so very steep, infancy to 12, moderate 12 to 20, and kind of stable from 20 to 60. Okay, now, but even at about age 20, when one reaches the early to mid 20s, yeah, we start noticing some declines in some functions, such as in reaction time and in memory, oddly enough, already starting to small differences, which don't lead to any meaningful differences, but there are some small differences that already occur with memory consolidation, even in the mid-20s. Yeah, or in terms of memory recall, trying to think of names like of actors and movies and stuff like that. People become a little slower from the mid-20s onward and into your 30s and 40s. And I know I certainly have experienced that. But you really don't see larger declines until about the mid-60s, yeah. And then with each decade, a bit more. But it's interesting where the decline occurs, yeah. It's less so with things such as vocabulary, general information, facts and figures, right? People know languages, they don't tend to lose those languages. And even interesting enough with things such as like playing the piano, right? That kind of well-performed kind of ability, people don't tend to lose as much. People tend to show greater declines are in things such as short-term memory and perceptual and spatial abilities. Yeah, working out puzzles and stuff like that, working with a map and so on. Okay, but I want to make it clear these are again between group differences. All right, just like with the ethnic racial or the gender differences, there are mean differences, but there's a lot of overlap between the bell-shaped curve data. Alrighty. In other words, there are some people in their 80s who perform better than people in their 60s, and then some people in their 60s who perform poorer than people in their 80s. Alrighty. The other good news is that there is also a lot of research to show that continued practice really helps people retain those abilities. And there's also regrettably the thing to the old maxim, if you don't use it, you lose it. Where you don't completely lose it, but the declines can be greater if you don't continue cognitive practice in things such as with memory or visual spatial problem solving. Okay. Now, for the individual standing within their group, okay, so for when you're age 12 compared to when you're age 6 compared to other 6-year-olds, or when you're 16 and compared to other 16-year-olds, your cohort, okay, one's standing within a group is relatively, for intelligence, already starts to stabilize at about age 6. Yeah, so if you're a bright 6-year-old, odds are you're going to be a bright, always on the upper end, even at 16 or 30s, or even well into your 60s. Yeah, and vice versa. So you're standing within your particular age group. Yeah, already stabilizes at about age 6. Okay. Now, regarding heredity and environment, um, I think I'm just gonna, I do want to point this out, what heritability is, okay? Heritability is often misconstrued. It's often thought about as how much genes, how much something is explained by genes, yeah? So you have a math ability. How much of that is genetic? Yeah, is that 60% genetic, 80% genetic? No, you can't answer it that way. It doesn't work out that simply. What heritability refers to, yeah, it has to do with score variability. Okay, so heritability has to do with how much your scores can vary. Right? So your math scores may vary a lot when you're young, but as you go through grade school, right, the variability tends to be less and less. Okay, you tend to you know, your how you score, right? When you're younger might really vary. You might do super high, super low, depending on day or the week. But as you get older, it becomes far more stable. It doesn't vary as much. Okay. Now, that the way your scores can vary is very. There's been a lot of data to show that IQ performance, cognitive performance, as related to IQ, um, has demonstrated heritabilities between 0.40 and 0.80. Okay, so moderate to high. But again, that doesn't mean your math ability is 40% due to genes. All that means is that about 0.40 to upwards of 0.80 of how your scores vary is a function of genes. Okay, and again, how you perform is always going to be a complex interaction between genes and the environment. You know the old maxim. Okay, this I think I can. Just important. There have been a number of factors related to environmental contributors to IQ performance. Certainly in the family, the presence of resources, the use of language. If parents use a lot of have a high vocabulary and use that vocabulary around their children will benefit from that. Interesting enough, older mothers, yeah, in contrast to, let's say, young mothers like who are 16 or 17, older mothers who are in their mid 20s or 30s, yeah, mid 30s or so, tend to foster greater IQ performance. Okay, maybe when we meet personally, we can discuss why that might be the case. And finally, it's important to understand the different types. And this is more related to the history of testing, but it's important history to be familiar with. The difference between different types of culture-based tests. Okay. First of all, one attempt at testing intelligence included a group of tests called culture-free tests. Now, the culture-free tests were tests that essentially use nonverbal kind of tasks. Yeah, to determine what IQ is in order to remove any kind of cultural bias. That was kind of the idea that if you took out things about information, facts and facts, and verbally based things and kept them more nonverbal, let's say the visual spatial organization, puzzles, and things of that sort, that you're more likely to have something that's free of culture. Okay, so a number of tests were developed to be culture free, and research was done to see if there were differences. But in the end, culture free tests didn't demonstrate what they had hoped to be able to demonstrate. They still tended to find a group difference between whites and blacks, with blacks tending to perform lower on these tests than their white counterparts. The next one were culture fair tests. Now, the difference here is these tests were developed to find common tasks across different cultures, such as coming up with categories, having to select stimuli from a group of random stimuli. So things that may be important across different cultures to be able to do. Okay. In the end, it ended up being a test that included a lot of nonverbal stuff, but with the focus being on trying to find what's common across groups. Okay, so this is an example of a culture fair test developed by Cattell, where a person's asked to pick out the two odd items, kind of obvious here, I think, boom, boom. This one, not so much so, but it's right here and here, these two. And here's another one, right? Try to find what should be filled here. It's obviously that one. Okay, and what logically follows this? Yeah. Um, so what logically follows this sequence? So 1, 2, 3 probably be this. And from this sequence, it'd probably be let's see, verse 6 right here. Okay, that's the correct answer. I mean, that looks pretty close to, so it's one of these two. Okay, but again, these tests, much like the previous culture-free test, really had low predictive validity. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mention this about the culture-free test, but they were weak in terms of predictive validity. Okay, they didn't predict occupational school functioning, and if a test can't make a prediction, it's probably not going to be used that much. It's not going to have that much value. Same thing with the culture fair test, low predictive validity. Finally, tests were also, is what's also important to keep in mind are tests that were referred to as culture specific. Yeah, that actually is kind of the flip side. Instead of getting away from verbally based tests, turning towards verbally based tests, but including items such as information and facts that people from different groups would know because of their environmental experiences. Yeah, so to have a Latin-based factual test, which would include vocabulary, historic events, and so on. Okay. But again, these tests ended up demonstrating low predictive validity. All righty. And with that, that's all I have to say about chapter 7. We went through a lot of stuff here. With that, we'll stop here, and I will see you again in class, but also in our next YouTube lecture, chapter 8. All right? Have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.